There once was a duck named Quacker who would wag his tail like a dog, and it seemed so strange in the sun or the rain that a duck would wag his tail at all. Could it be that Quacker was all mixed up and thought it was a pup instead of a duck? I don't think so, said a boy named Joe, for I knew his brothers and sisters. They all had feathers, and they all could swim, and they all could fly, and they looked like him. So Quacker must have learned to wag his tail from Lucky and Zeus the dogs, while playing in the woods, and down by the pond, and over the stumps and logs. I think I'll ask, said the bird to the bee, as it stared at Quacker sitting under that tree. Quacker, are you really a duck? If so, why do you wag your tail like a pup? So Quacker just stared them in the eyes and said, Mr. Bird and Mr. Bee, sitting there in that sycamore tree, why do you want to know about me? If I flap my wings or wag my tail or look for a bug inside of a shell, it's just me, it's just my way. I wag my tail most every day. And when I talk, I honk and quack, look straight ahead and never back. There are no rules for a way to be. Just be yourself, sit in your tree. Bee, you buzz, and bird, you chirp. I wag my tail and little kids burp. It's just a little thing I do, but I will stop if it bothers you. No, please don't stop. You wag your tail, we understand, and think it's swell. But you cannot know if you do not ask, and so we did, and now it's past. So goodbye, said Bird, goodbye, said Bee, and we'll tell the rest who look and see, and say it's fine to be yourself. In the next story, Quacker meets Mrs. Moo. Quacker meets Mrs. Moo. So Quacker the duck went on his way, wagging his tail like a dog, and he decided to rest at his favorite spot, by the pond in the shade on a log. He had just closed his eyes and was almost asleep, when all of a sudden he was knocked to his feet. He fluttered and flopped and honked and quacked and flew to the woods before he ever looked back. And there by the logs, to the reason he flew, it was a cow named Mrs. Moo. Quacker, she said as she chewed on some grass, I'm sorry I scared you, but you sure flew fast. So Quacker came waddling back to the shade to rest at last in the bed he had made. And when it was perched and all settled down, he said, Mrs. Moo, you sure are a clown to take your long tail and knock me down. Then Mrs. Moo said, Quacker, I didn't see you there, for I was eating my lunch with my head in the air. And the flies and mosquitoes were bothering me, so I took my long tail and I swatted 3. But when my long tail flopped down again, it hit on your head, she said with a grin. And although it wasn't funny, I didn't mean to. But just like I said, I never saw you. For it isn't nice to scare someone, 'cause they might get hurt if they start to run. And it never is fun to hurt anyone. In the next story, Quacker meets Canadian Goose. Quacker meets Canadian Goose. Now Quacker the duck was wandering around on the farm where he was at, so he waddled on down to a nice cool pond, plunged in with a splatter, splat, splat. He swam like a frog, and then like a dog, and then like a little duck do, when all of a sudden his head was a-buddin', a goose was a-swimming there too. Well, hello, said Quacker. Hello, said Goose. And now that the howdy-do-dos are all in the past, he said with a laugh, you're the duck that met Mrs. Moo. You're quite right, said Quacker, with a honk and a quack. But tell me, don't I know you? I've seen you somewhere, maybe up in the air. You sure look familiar, you do. I live up north, where it snows a lot, and they call me Canadian Goose. But I fly down to visit this nice warm spot, to swim in the pond just like you. Canadian Goose, Quacker said with a grin. I have a cousin who lives up there. Could you possibly be him? Well, let's walk and talk, said Quacker the duck, and sit under the big oak tree. You tell me about you and all that you know, and then I'll tell you about me. So they waddled and walked and squawked and talked, but found that they were no kin. 'Cause Canadian Goose was found by a moose, a little orphan goose he was then. You haven't a mother or father, you know? Quacker said with delight. "Well, I'm sure I do, but I don't know who, but why do you smile at my plight? Do you think it's funny 'cause I have no parents to love me and hold me tight?" "Of course not," said Quacker. "I'm just like you, except I have sisters and brothers. But I never knew Dad, and I know that it's sad, and I barely remember my mother. I just felt that I was the only one who never knew Mom and Dad. But now that I see that you're just like me, it kind of made my heart glad. 'Cause we're kind of kin in our own special way to know that there's love in the world. 'Cause you wouldn't be goose if it weren't for a moose, and I wouldn't be duck without squirrel." In the next story, find out why a duck wouldn't be duck without squirrel. Quacker meets his dad, the squirrel. Now, Quacker the duck had said goodbye to his new friend, Canadian Goose, and all by himself he waddled along when a train with a big red caboose went clankety-clank, clackety-clack down the railroad track. He said, "What fun! I think I'll run and take a ride, but then I'll come back." So he ran as hard as he could go, but the train just went on by. So he said at last, "This train is too fast, so I'm going to have to fly." But just before he could flap his wings and catch the train on the track, he hit his foot on some hidden thing and landed flat on his back. And as he sat there with his head in a daze, his beak was bent and blue. He thought, what a dummy, 'cause catching a train is a dangerous thing to do. Instead of landing flat on my back, I could have been killed by that train on the track. The good Lord above has taught me a lesson, so this aching bent beak is really a blessing. So Quacker went down to a spot by the creek, sat down on a log with his aching bent beak, when all of a sudden a voice from the trees called out his name somewhere in the breeze. "I know that voice," Quacker said with surprise, as he stared at the trees with apple-sized eyes. "There's only one voice like that in the world. It's gotta be my dad the squirrel." By the way, folks, you see, I was an orphan duck, and the squirrel Charlie found me and raised me, but he almost never taught me to fly. "Come up here, Quacker, come see me," said Charlie the squirrel sitting high in the tree. So Quacker flew up there with all of his might and hugged his dad chokingly tight. Well, they chitted and chatted, had a wonderful time as they talked and squawked there in the pines.